The bullet that should have killed Elijah Kane tore through his left side just below the ribs on a cold November evening in Abilene. He had drawn second and fired first, dropping the man across the saloon floor before stumbling out into the street with blood running warm between his fingers. That was the night he decided he was done. Not because he had lost his nerve, but because he had looked down at the dead man and felt nothing at all, and the emptiness of that feeling frightened him more than any gun ever had. He rode south for weeks, half dead in the saddle, surviving on creek water and strips of dried beef he could barely chew through his fever. The desert opened up around him like a furnace, and he was sure the vultures circling overhead were measuring him for a meal. But the horse kept walking, and Elijah kept breathing, and on the 12th day he came upon a small valley town tucked between red rock walls where a river ran clean and cold through green pastures. A wooden sign at the edge of town read Stillwater, and beneath it, in smaller letters, someone had carved the words, "Population? Enough." A widow named Clara Dunham found him collapsed near her fence post. She was a tall woman with sun-browned skin and hands roughened by years of working the land alone. She dragged him into her house, pulled the infection from his wound with a hot knife and a poultice that smelled like death, and nursed him through 3 days of fever dreams in which he screamed the names of men he had killed. When he woke, she was sitting by the window darning a sock, and she looked at him with eyes that held neither judgment nor pity. "You talk a lot in your sleep," she said. "I don't care who you were. I care who you plan to be." He stayed, at first because he was too weak to leave, and then because he found he did not want to. He mended fences for Clara. He learned to work cattle without cursing. He discovered muscles in his back he never knew existed, and calluses on his hands that came from honest labor instead of gripping a pistol. The town accepted him slowly, the way small towns do, watching from porches and over counters to see if he would prove himself decent or dangerous. He proved himself decent. He helped the school teacher repair the roof of the schoolhouse. He pulled old Tom Brewer's wagon out of a ditch during a rainstorm. He sat in the small church on Sundays and listened to words about forgiveness and wondered if they applied to a man like him. Months passed. The wound healed into a thick scar that ached when the weather turned. He hung his gun belt on a nail in the barn and let the dust collect on the leather. He and Clara began to share suppers that lasted longer than they needed to, conversations that wandered into the late hours, silences that felt comfortable rather than empty. One evening she reached across the table and took his hand, and he felt something crack open inside his chest that he had believed was sealed shut forever. It was not love yet, but it was the ground in which love could grow, and for the first time in his life he wanted to tend something rather than destroy it. Spring came to Stillwater with wildflowers and warm wind, and Elijah Kane began to believe that a man could truly start over. He was wrong. They rode in on a Tuesday, 4 men on tired horses, trailing dust and bad intentions. Their leader was a man named Virgil Ketch, narrow-faced and sharp-eyed, with a reputation that preceded him like the smell of smoke before a fire. He had been a Confederate raider during the war and had never stopped raiding when the war ended. The men with him were cut from the same cloth, hard, hollow men who had learned that taking was easier than earning and killing was easier than asking. They took over the saloon first, then the general store. They told the people of Stillwater that they would be staying a while and that the town would provide for them, food, whiskey, money, and silence. The sheriff, a kind old man named Harlan Dupree, who had not fired his pistol in 6 years, walked into the saloon to reason with them. They beat him until he could not stand and threw him into the street as a message. The town bent under the weight of its fear. Doors closed, shutters latched. People walked with their eyes down and spoke in whispers. Elijah watched from Clara's porch and felt the old darkness stir inside him like a snake uncoiling. "Don't," Clara said. She had seen the way his eyes changed, the way his jaw set like stone. "Tell them to go," Clara said. "You'll never be able to live with yourself if you don't." He rode into town at dawn. The street was empty, except for a dog sleeping in the shade and the smell of coffee drifting from the hotel. He tied his horse to the rail outside the saloon and pushed through the doors. Virgil and his 3 men were inside, playing cards and drinking whiskey that was not theirs. "I want you out of Stillwater by noon," Elijah said. Virgil looked up from his cards. "And if we don't go, then you don't go anywhere, ever." The silence that followed was the kind that stretches time, that makes seconds feel like minutes and minutes feel like hours. Elijah watched their hands. He had always watched the hands. A man's eyes could lie, but his hands always told the truth. The youngest of Virgil's men moved first, reaching for the pistol on his hip with the desperate speed of someone who had never faced a real gunfighter. Elijah drew and fired in a single motion that felt less like a choice and more like a reflex, a language his body had never forgotten. The young man fell. The second man rose from his chair, and Elijah shot him through the shoulder, spinning him to the wall. The third man threw his hands up and backed into the corner. Then it was just Elijah and Virgil. Virgil had not moved. He sat in his chair with his cards still in one hand, his other hand resting on the table near his holster. "You're fast," Virgil said. "Faster than I expected." "Last chance," Elijah said. Virgil smiled, and his hand moved, and Elijah fired. The bullet caught Virgil in the chest, and he fell backwards, chair and all, and lay still on the sawdust floor with that thin smile frozen on his face. Elijah stood in the gun smoke and the silence and felt the emptiness try to swallow him again. But this time it was different. This time he felt the weight of what he had done, the sorrow and the necessity of it tangled together like roots beneath the soil. He was not the man he had been. That man would have felt nothing. This man felt everything. He holstered the revolver, walked out into the morning light, and rode back to the small house at the edge of town where Clara was standing on the porch waiting for him, her hand shielding her eyes from the rising sun. He dismounted and walked to her, and she held him while he trembled, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing to say that the silence did not already hold. He hung the gun belt back on the nail in the barn. The dust would collect again. The scar on his side would ache in the rain. But the wildflowers were blooming in the valley, and the river ran clean through the pastures of Stillwater. And Elijah Kane, who had once been called the devil's right hand, picked up a hammer and went back to mending the fence.